Welcome to another new episode of Sustainability Forward, where my co-host Carmine and me, Rishi, we discuss some interesting and important issues around sustainability. As I've said before, we find it very interesting when we have a guest on the podcast. And it's extra special because it's a bright and sunny day in London, which is both rare and beautiful. Welcome, Carmine. Would you please introduce our guest?
Thank you, Rishi. And for once, London has a better time weather than continental Europe, probably today. So, yes, today we have a very special guest, a friend from IMD. We have Adrian Deckler joining us as a special guest. Let me tell you a little bit about Adrian. Adrian is a political scientist, environmental advocacy expert, and innovator. Adrian is a senior researcher writer at MD, a business school in Switzerland, at the MD Center for Sustainable and Inclusive Business, focused on businesses and biodiversity issues. He previously worked as a head of strategy and development at the Luke Hoffman Institute. He has driven and managed a large number of innovative projects and ventures for environmental conservation. Before joining the Institute, he was head of policy and advocacy at WWF International Global and Regional Policy Unit from 2008 to 2016. Adrian has an extensive experience of international negotiations on environmental issues, including leading WWF delegations for biodiversity COPs. So Adrian, you are very welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Adrian, first questions first, right? We have, I think by now, the industry, the energy industry, the society in general has probably caught up with the conversation on climate change. But what we wanted to ask, given your background, is why is it important to talk about biodiversity specifically? And if you could help us understand its linkages to climate change, food security, resource scarcity, and all of that, I think that will help the audience understand
Sure.
The importance of biodiversity.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm an environmental activist, definitely at heart anyway, if not on everyday life. And the situation is quite catastrophic. So on a personal level, I think the fact that institutions like the WWF is saying that we've lost 73% of wildlife populations in the past 50 years is extremely alarming. We're talking about birds, animals, habitats, entire ecosystems. So on a personal level, that resonates quite a bit with me, especially because the trends are really quite negative. But of course, if that doesn't resonate with you, then yes, there is a direct link to the economy. It's been said that biodiversity underpins over half of global GDP, $44 trillion annually. That can seem a bit abstract, but basically a whole bunch of industries, if not every single industry in the world, depends on biodiversity. So you mentioned climate change, and the link there is absolutely clear. So, for example, cutting deforestation in half to 2030 would save $3.7 trillion in greenhouse gas emissions. So climate change isn't, if we could solve climate change from just a purely technical position by sucking, all the carbon out or through geoengineering or something, it would not be the most efficient. The most efficient is simply cutting deforestation. Conversely, also, it's been shown that planting diverse forest, as opposed to just monocultured forest, as is sometimes the case, absorbs 50 to 70% more carbon from the atmosphere. So biodiversity really plays a role in climate mitigation, reducing emissions. It also plays a critical role in adaptation. So as there are more and more storm surges in coastal areas, as there are more hurricanes inland, et cetera, biodiversity, meaning trees, kelp forest, mangroves, wetlands, coral reefs, these all play a major role in buffering those effects. And so biodiversity is absolutely critical in the fight for climate change. It's critical to mitigate and to adapt. So that's one thing. And then you mentioned food security. I mean, 3/4 of all of our critical food crops, the crops that we rely on to feed ourselves. 3/4 of them depend on pollinators, so bees and various insects. So if we lose that biodiversity, the habitats the bees need, we lose 3/4 of our crops. We're not talking just about food insecurity here. We're talking about potential famine. Sometimes those links are quite clear, and sometimes they are less clear. Like in healthcare, for example, over half of all medication, and that includes cancer medicines, have been created using wild species, the molecules found in wild species. And so a lot of our wild species we haven't even cataloged yet. So if we lose them before even having cataloged them, then we're really putting our own future healthcare, even present healthcare, at risk. So the links have been done. They're well documented by now. There's been many, many studies. The question is, how do you integrate that into everyday accounting?
Interesting. We actually, just the last episode that we did was with someone who's been who's a beekeeper and has been involved in the business and works on the environmental side quite significantly, and explained to us and our audience very well, the linkage between biodiversity, how it's affecting the bee population, and how it's affecting obviously the production of honey, but it's affecting many, many, many other chains around the world. So very interesting point.
Where I live, we have fruit trees everywhere, and these fruit trees, the apples, the peaches, the apricots, all of these things depend on pollinators. So unless you want to go using people to pollinate them by hand, or use drones, all of which are extremely expensive, then you've got nature. It's doing it for free for you every day.
And has it done for many, many years.
Many years.
And I just want to go back to the figures you mentioned, Ade, because I found this really scaring. You said 70% down. So does it mean that when I was a child, my parents gave me a book with all these pictures of animals all around the world, very thick book. So does it mean that 70% of the book now my children will not?
No, this is a headline number. It's very helpful. Biodiversity is extremely hard to measure, not because we don't have the tools or the science to measure it, but because it's inherently local. So an ecosystem in Australia isn't comparable to one in Brazil or Switzerland, et cetera. And so the metrics will change. We can have a very accurate picture of the state of biodiversity, or whether it's progress, whether it's diminished. We can attribute certain preference for certain indicators, and scientists love to do that. But overall, in order to kind of communicate to the broad public, we have to latch on to these single numbers. What that number is, if you actually look at it, it's 73% of loss in average size of wildlife populations. And those are populations that are monitored. But of course, we're monitoring a tiny fraction. So it's an indicator. It's sort of a window into broader trends. What's even kind of more alarming is that we're losing charismatic species. So people are aware of white rhinos and elephants and giraffes and things like that. But there's the whole ecosystem behind all these insects, all of the millions of species that haven't even been discovered yet, because we keep on discovering new species that are losing, that don't even have books written about them because we've never even discovered them.
You're right.
So the 73 is, if you talk to scientists, they can kind of add caveats, and it's not exactly that, but it's a general trend. The thing that I would add to that as well is this number just came out about a month ago, or just a little bit over a month ago. They come up with this number every 2 years. It's called the Living Planets Index, and they work with ZSL, the London Zoological Society. It's a very, very well done number. They come up with this every 2 years. Last time was 69%. So, we thought that was quite bad. That's 4% more in just 2 years. So what matters, is almost less that headline as the trend.
Got it. Thank you for clarifying. Now, as we're recording this episode, we had the COP in Baku that just ended. And actually, this has been the second COP this year out of 3. COP, as many of you know, is the Conference of Parties organized by UN. What I didn't know after this year, actually, there are 3 COPs going on. we had this year actually planning all three of them. The first one has been the one in Cali, in Colombia, around biodiversity. Then, of course, Baku for climate, and then there will be another inside the river for land desertification. Let's talk a little bit more today about this COP on biodiversity. If you can help us a little bit, Adrian, for those who are unfamiliar with this COP, and actually it's the 16 of it, it's COP16. Can you help us to explain what it is, how it differs from the other well-known climate COPs? And why should we even pay attention to this biodiversity-focused conference?
So in 1992, the UN gathered in Rio de Janeiro and around what was called the Earth Summits, and that produced 3 UN conventions on environmental issues. First on climate change, second on biodiversity, third on desertification. So there are 3 conventions that were created pretty much at the same time. They each have their own kind of genesis. But in 1992, and I remember this well because I was 12 years old, and there were a whole bunch of activities. I was over the Atlantic in Paris, but that Earth Summit in Rio really did impact me, and I would say that it even it played a role in turning me into an environmentalist. That created those 3 conventions. Because climate change was considered to be more urgent, the conference of the parties, so the parties to the convention that meets to discuss issues, it was decided to meet every year. And that first meeting took place in 1995. The first biodiversity COP, as well as the first desertification COP, took place in 1994. And those are every other year. And so every other year, you've got those 3 COPs happening. But sometimes the biodiversity COP, and this is beyond me, but sometimes they were in the spring or February or so on. They've changed a little bit. They tend to be towards the end of the year at the same time as the climate COPs, but not always. But this year is a really interesting moment because all 3 COPs took place pretty much back to back. So we had the biodiversity COP end of October, beginning of November. Then we had the climate change COP in November, and then desertification COP starting just at the end of November and through December. So it's a really interesting moment in time because those 3 issues, they were the environmental system was broken down into those 3 massive issues in order to make them more digestible. Each one of these issues is so complicated that it deserved its own, focus and attention around a convention and around conferences. But of course, they're extremely related. So there are pros and there are cons. We could have tackled all of these every year, every other year. But basically, it's the same mechanism. I mean, the people have started to be more aware of climate change. Of course, the first COP on climate change was 95, and then 97 we had Kyoto, and Kyoto did have that kind of impact as well. It's a protocol that people are familiar with that has permeated the sort of the general consciousness. So quite early on, the climate COPs did, have an impact on the general public. The biodiversity COPs play the same role, and they also have certain protocols. So there's the Cartagena protocol that was negotiated in 2000. That's on biosafety. That actually does guide how companies deal with biohazards. It asks for the precautionary principle to be followed, and companies that are involved in linked to biosafety, biohazards do follow that protocol. So it does have an impact, even if it's not as well known as the Kyoto Protocol. There's also the Nagoya Protocol, which was negotiated more recently in 2010. That enshrines basically the need for access and benefit sharing. So the genetic resources or the resources generally coming from biodiversity being used in economic systems like the pharmaceutical industry or aromas, food, and so on. That's a protocol that was created by the COP that guides that kind of action. So, they do produce these global frameworks. The COPs are a place where global consensus is reached, and even if it's every other year, they do produce those global frameworks, like the Global Biodiversity Framework that came out in 2022. That was negotiated for quite a long time. Is quite ambitious. It is often called the Paris Agreement for Biodiversity. I think that's a good comparison. So they basically play the same role. It's just the issue is different. And the final thing I'll say is that this year there was a lot of talk of, not combining, but having those conventions and those COPs talk more to each other in the past. This year is the first time that I've seen that there's really been concrete action on that. So the three presidencies got together and created this thing called the Rio Trio Initiative. There are some declarations that came out, notably in Cali. And so I think it's going to be very interesting next year because there is no biodiversity and desertification COP, but the climate COP takes place in Brazil. And Brazil, going back to its historical ties to the Earth Summit in 1992, and then what they called Rio Plus 20, which took place 20 years later in Rio as well, and created, ultimately led to the Sustainable Development Goals. Brazil has a really important role to play, has a very active voice in environmental discussions, and they're hosting the climate COP. And so it'll be interesting to see if there's even closer integration of biodiversity and climate change in the country that's host to the largest part of the Amazon, because they are so linked.
A very, very interesting history of the various COPs. And I certainly didn't know much about this area. So, Adrian, specifically with the COP in Cali, the biodiversity COP, what were some of the highlights coming out of this year, and what were some of the areas where you think we fell short?
Yeah, I mean, it's going into Cali. Most people in the know were calling this an implementation COP. So we had this new global biodiversity framework that happened, it seems 2 years ago. Okay, that might seem a long time ago, but that was at the last COP. So this is a COP where we're not building a massive new framework or anything. We're really just trying to see how we implement this. What I found really, and I sat this COP out. I've been to many COPs in the past, but I didn't in my role now. We didn't think it was necessary for me to be there, and I was happy to also see it from the outside. What I found fascinating from the outside is how much attention it garnered and media interest. I really think that's unprecedented. I could potentially be wrong, but I feel like an observer that more people knew about this COP and what was happening, and that it was happening, and more people went there and expected something. So that's a very good thing, I think. On the other hand, it also, I think, created a whole bunch of energy that was maybe expecting something big, and it was an implementation COP. So the fact that nothing sort of headline grabbing happened or to me shouldn't be surprising, but it could have been seen as a big disappointment for a lot of observers. I mean, the key thing about implementation is, I'd say there are two main things. One is money, and that's a big one. And of course, a lot of the headlines were about that. It was, not enough money. The dynamic, to make a complicated picture as simple as possible, essentially the rich countries have gotten rid of most of their biodiversity, and where the biodiversity is in emerging and developing countries. And so there is that dynamic, which is quite similar in the climate change space, that's
Yes.
developed countries have to pay to help finance the conservation and restoration of biodiversity in developing and emerging countries. That's a dynamic which is never, it's always fraught with potential disaster. It's basically the main leverage of these negotiations. This happens every other year, and every year in climate, where there's that, tension, and the money was not there, and that is, a low light. It is very unfortunate that countries that have money are not willing to spend that kind of money to save biodiversity, just the way they, printed money for COVID and implemented emergency measures for COVID. They're not doing that for biodiversity. So,
or actually to subsidize something that is harmful to
yeah,
biodiversity. So it's so very controversial. Yeah.
Yeah, that I would say, to me, that's a much deeper flaw. So the fact that rich countries right now didn't agree to pay billions for developing countries to conserve, it's a complicated issue. There's not a lot of money after COVID. There's, let's just say it's not too surprising. Maybe I'm just too cynical. It's not too surprising. What is amazingly surprising is that we continue to, and Cristina Figueres phrased this beautifully, we continue to finance our own extinction. I mean, we subsidize to the order of $2.6 trillion annually measures that directly harm nature. So overfishing, monoculture, synthetic fertilizers, fossil fuel subsidies. So it's not just that governments aren't, finding the money to restore. They're finding a whole bunch of money, 2.6 trillion to be accurate, to actually subsidize the destruction of nature. And that's something that I remember when I was at the COPs, it was already talked. It's not like a new issue, public subsidies, phasing out public subsidy. I'm pretty sure it was already in the Aichi targets. That was decided in 2010. So already in 2010, and obviously before that, it was understood that we needed to reform the public subsidies going to the destruction of nature. This is not a new issue. And yet, instead of achieving or making progress towards the target of reducing these by 500 billion annually, we've actually increased by 800 billion since that pledge was made. So we're actually spending 800 billion more annually on destroying nature than we were some years ago. So I would definitely call that a low light. I think that's the word you used. That is, a low light. But yeah, I mean, there's also a dangerous road, which is to say, well, because that's not happening, therefore these COPs are worthless. And that's I think a false conclusion, because the COPs are only as good as the member parties. Basically, it's all up to individual countries to act. And we have this framework. We now have nearly half the countries have national plans to implement this global framework. So, it's a little bit boring, I must say. It's a grind. It's a little bit every day. You're scratching when you're passionate like me about nature. You can be very alarmed and depressed that it's too little, too late. But without these COPs, without that energy, without that structure, that framework, then Lord knows where we would be. I mean, it would be probably a lot worse. So these COPs also are a place where we can take the heartbeat. So every 2 years in the case of biodiversity, okay, well, how many countries have these plans? How funded are they? What is the state of subsidies, and so on. So
I agree, and probably on the same lines, probably we believe them. A world with COP is definitely better than a world without COP for biodiversity and climate. Yes, not perfect, but it's
not enough.
But it's not enough.
It's not enough.
You recently wrote an article out of Cali, this kind of experience, very well written article. We'll post it here in our notes of the podcast with a lot of details from this COP. And this article, in terms of, let me call it again, highlight, you mentioned this digital sequencing information at DSI as one of the main takeaway from this latest COP. Can you tell us a little bit more about it? How does it work? What's the mechanism? And why is it so important for funding conservation efforts?
Yeah, so conservation efforts are severely underfunded. The number fluctuates, and it's very hard to come up with an exact number, but it's basically in the ballpark of 700 billion annually missing for biodiversity conservation. So the name of the game is to try and find that. A lot of the knee-jerk reflex is, okay, well, governments will pay for that. And for the record, I'm not against governments paying for that. I'd be happy for my taxes to go for that. But the issue also is, how do we get companies in the private sector to contribute, and not just contribute, towards that 700 billion target, but contribute their fair share to the use of nature. So we talked about specific examples, depending on crops and so on. So what are some of the mechanisms that we can put in place in order for both for the private sector to contribute, but also for that value that biodiversity is contributing to economic models, to business models, to be, more represented? And so I think that's why I personally find this agreement interesting. So the agreement basically is that, so there's been a lot of discussion around digital sequencing information, DSI for short. That's basically, we've been going around, scientists have been going around taking samples of wildlife a bit everywhere for decades. In the recent past, there's been a trend to digitalize the DNA sequencing of that. And so those are available on public databases. It's still continued to be populated. And some companies, not to single out any, but particularly in the pharmaceutical industry, in the food industry, healthcare in general, aromas. Those companies have sometimes been using this DNA information, which is available in these public databases, for revenue generating goods. So there's the example of a COVID vaccine that was used by using the sequencing, the DNA sequencing of other viruses, et cetera. And that's been generating tens of billions of dollars annually in revenue. What is the part that needs to go back to that initial effort of collecting the DNA and conserving those wild species? So digital sequencing information has been discussed for quite a while. It also falls under this Nagoya Protocol of access and benefit sharing. So countries that are very rich in biodiversity want to be incentivized, let's say, to conserve that biodiversity, to actually to benefit when a private company, often in the West, will be making profit off of that DNA. And so what's interesting is that there was an agreement to create a fund. So it's now called the Cali Fund. I think that's really what it is in the text. There is a fund that's itself quite interestingly structured. It includes indigenous peoples and so on. But the fund is going to collect payment from private companies, or I mean, publicly listed just companies. It's quite specifically written in the text, 1% of profits or 0.1% of revenue for companies meeting a certain criteria. And those are all laid out right there in the text. Those companies that use DNA from digital sequencing information databases will put that in the fund. So 1% of profit or 0.1% of revenue. And that money will be distributed. That's where the process is not fully, fully described. It's still being discussed exactly how the money is going to be distributed, but it's going to be distributed basically to biodiverse countries. I've read somewhere that they expect over $1 billion per year in this fund. For now, the contributions are voluntary, but there's also a push to legislate at the national level to make this mandatory in various countries. And so it actually is possible that this will raise, several billion. I don't want to be too hopeful, but maybe even dozens of billions of dollars annually. That's possible. So obviously, it's exciting to think that this money could be given to biodiversity conservation, but also just the underlying principle is really, really interesting one. If we can have that fund and that mechanism for companies to contribute based on how they're using biodiversity, we haven't cracked the whole picture, but it's really interesting dynamic. So that's why I insisted on that. I'm currently trying to get in touch with people who know more about this than me. I'm trying to dig this. I'm trying to get in touch also with some pharma companies, et cetera. I think a lot of them haven't thought this through, don't know what this is going to look like. And I think that's going to be the discussion that's going to take place, in the coming years.
I mean, in terms of these actions, which mainly sit at the intersection of business and policy making, Adrian, could we look at actions for individuals? We have, as I said earlier, a wide listenership in many countries, and very often we get questions, right? Like, what can we do about our individual carbon footprint? So the question to you is, how can individuals make a difference, right? In protecting biodiversity, in helping with some of the goals set out in biodiversity COPs, and in general, sort of driving more consciousness towards biodiversity?
Wow. I mean, first off, be courageous, because these are big issues, and I find I'm always divided about putting individual responsibility. Obviously, it's hugely empowering, but it's also very disempowering, because we see the scale of these problems. You're like, what can I do? Especially if I live in a city, which is the case for over half of humanity. If I live in a densely populated city, like, what the heck can I do? I mean, there's a whole bunch of things you can do. You can help local efforts, local NGOs or international NGOs if you want, but there are sort of a lot of associations and conglomerations of people who are doing good action on biodiversity. It's so inherently local that these are often local. So I personally support an NGO here in Switzerland. They basically they own land. They buy, they convert, and they monitor land, and it's very transparent the way it's done, and you can visit these places, etc. So I personally derive a fair amount of pleasure, yeah, I really think that that makes a difference at the local level. Trying to be careful about your consumption is absolutely huge. I mean, particularly in food, like actually believing in these certification standards. They're not perfect. They sometimes get bad publicity because they're not perfect, but they're sure as hell are better than the alternative. And so spending a bit more of your budget and your interest on these certified products does help nature and biodiversity. Being active publicly, knowing about these issues, educating yourself, being involved. If you have the possibility of voting and things like that, those are all important. And I would say they're all equally important. And if you are as lucky as me as to have a garden, there are plenty of little things you can do, even if your garden is small. What find out what species are endangered in your area. Find out which plants these species prefer. Don't just have lawn, in your garden. Have bushes. Have a few trees. Educate yourself about what butterflies need. I'm getting carried away now, of course, but but yeah, it depends how much involved you want to be, but there are plenty of things you can do. You can try to convince the company you work with to have a biodiversity plan, all these things. So it's tricky to put, a lot of the responsibility on individuals because it's such a big issue when you look at these, for example, the subsidies issue. But also there's a lot of things you can do.
And I love the idea of gardening. Really. It's a very good also activity to do with your kids that
It's
are
a wonderful activity.
born in cities, very urban, and lost the contact with what is a butterfly.
And there are things you can do in cities as well, and there are not, there are parks and so on. So.
And by the way, Adrian, also you mentioned Switzerland before, so probably also in ending the episode, there's a good news to share about Switzerland because of a referendum that just passed a few days back. So the federal government saw the motorway network that wanted to increase more than 5 times over the past years, and still to increase. But the Swiss population with the referendum just stopped that. And they refused to further expanding motorways and constructing new roads. And instead asking the government to invest that amount of money on healthcare or in policies that are actually helping environment. So I think it's a good story where 52.7% Switzerland voted in this direction.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we did, not to burst the bubble, but there was a quite negative result in the biodiversity referendum a few weeks back. You could argue that it was not a very well built law, and it was rejected for a whole bunch of reasons, not just because population is against biodiversity. But I agree with you. The highway bill, a lot of the arguments actually did center around biodiversity. I'm not saying that's why it won. It won for a whole bunch of reasons, including that it costs a lot. But there is a consciousness that no, we can't just keep on building in green areas. At some point, something's got to give. So let's see how they deal with this and increase mobility through public transportation as well.
Great, Adrian. Thank you very much for this amazing insights on biodiversity. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and I am sure our audience will enjoy it as well. So thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for having me.
So for all our audience around the world, as we get close to the end of this year, and you consider buying presents, gifts, consider Adrian's comment on reducing personal consumption. One gift that you can give to your near and dear ones is the gift of a podcast. So anybody that's interested in sustainability, share this the link to our episode, which is available on all major podcast networks, as well as we have a page on LinkedIn. So consider sharing this with your friends. Obviously, it's all free, and we'd love to have more listenership in newer countries and newer parts of the world. Thank you again for joining us. Carmine, thank you for joining as well. Take care.
Thank you, Rishi. Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers.